I'm going to take you back to maybe elementary school or maybe teaching elementary school with church and children's church and Sunday school and VBS. How many of you know this song? If you know it, you can sing along with me. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock, and the rains came tumbling down. And the rains came down, and the sun came up. Flood came up. The rain came down, and the flood came up. The rain came down, and the flood came up, and the wise man's house stood firm. That came back from a day of vacation Bible school where you didn't get a package of music that changed every week or every year, right? And those earworm songs that get stuck in your head. But I remember when I did VBS and I did children's church, and we had these songs like that spoke truth. Usually they were straight from Scripture, and they allowed us to be able to learn these things. And so that verse comes from this Scripture. Matthew 7:24-27 says this: "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain came down, and the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house. Yet it did not fall because it has foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. And the rain came down, and the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house. And it fell with a great crash." We didn't get to sing the great crash verse, but it's really fun when you talk about great crash. So what is this scripture about? Well, first of all, it's about wisdom, right? It's about being wise and making sure that you build your house on a firm foundation so that way you don't end up with a great crash. It's about wisdom and taking time to build your faith on that foundation. But I want to suggest it has something else it talks about, and that is trust, and that is relationship. Because it says the man who hears this and does what it says is like the one who built the house. I don't know if a random stranger comes up to you and tells you to do something, how many of you automatically go and do it? Right? Nobody. But if someone you trust, someone you know, someone who you have had a relationship with, and you believe and you know that they are true to the word, if they tell you to do something, you're much more likely to do that, aren't you? So this verse, this song, is partly about building a foundation, but it's also about relationship and trust. And we are continuing our series through the I am statements of Jesus. Jesus says, "I am the light of the world, and I am the gate." And today, which Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd." Well, this continues, this scripture for today that was read is a continuation of our scripture from last week. And so I want to show you how it's talking about relationship. But first of all, if you weren't here or you don't remember, who was Jesus talking to last week? Was he talking to the people? No. He was talking to the Pharisees. In case you don't know, the Pharisees were a group of religious leaders in the Jewish leaders, and they were supposed to be good shepherds. They were supposed to be good stewards. They were supposed to be good leaders. And we talked about last week a story of a blind man who was blind, and Jesus healed him, and the man goes and is brought to the teachers and the Pharisees, and instead of encouraging him, instead of building him up, instead of loving him, they ridicule him. They push him down, and they try to silence him. And that's who Jesus is talking to when he says that you are supposed to be the shepherds. He says, "I am the gate." And the idea was that if you were in a town in that time, out in the field, there was a block, a pen that was set up, and anybody could drop their sheep off there. It was kind of like a sheep daycare, right? And you could bring your sheep and you could drop them off, and the next day you would come and you would call your sheep, and they would follow you because they had a relationship. they knew your voice. And so last week, Jesus says, I am the gate. You come through me. And those who climb over the walls are thieves and robbers. He's talking to these Pharisees, and he's making this comparison. He's saying that I am the gate, and you are supposed to be the good shepherds that care for their flock and take them out and watch over them and lead them to good water and good fields of grass, and you bring them back and that they are safe because they are in proximity to you. But they're not, because they weren't good shepherds. And so in today's scripture, it follows right after that. It says the previous one ends with they didn't understand and they were divided, and Jesus comes back again. He says, okay, let's try this again. He says, y'all were supposed to be good shepherds, but I am the good shepherd. He says, I'm the example that you were supposed to be. I do the things that you were supposed to do. You see, the Pharisees, they didn't love the people. They wanted to keep the power they had. They had a good life. They had Rome who kind of let them do what they wanted to do as long as it didn't get too rambunctious. And here comes Jesus, and Jesus is stirring up the crowds, and Jesus is talking to the people, and they are starting to question. And so Jesus is talking to them. He says, I am the good shepherd. And so what I want to do today is take this scripture that was read and look at 3 characteristics of relationships. Because that's really what we're talking about, right? Relationship between the shepherd and the sheep. And they weren't cutting it, and Jesus says, here's what it's supposed to be. But I want to also suggest that these same things we are talking about with relationships apply to our own relationships as well. Because we all have relationships, don't we? We all have friends, we have family, we have coworkers, we have those with whom trust us and who we trust, and those for whom we are entrusted. And so listen for that parallel. I'm not going to point it out all the whole way through, but listen for that parallel about things and ways that we can build our relationships to. The first thing to point out is that relationships require responsibility. Relationships have to say, I am responsible for you. Right? I am a father. I am responsible for my child. I'm responsible for my family. If you lead a ministry, you're responsible. If you have a friend group, you may have responsibility. Relationships first require responsibility. For me to say, you are mine, and because of that, I'm going to take care of you. John 10, 11 through 13 says this, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hired hand is not the shepherd and does not own the sheep. So when he, the hired hand, sees the wolf coming, he abandons the sheep and runs away. Then the wolf attacks the flock and scatters it. The man runs away because he is a hired hand and cares nothing for the sheep. Now, don't point fingers and don't call out names, but have you ever been to like a convenience store or a fast food restaurant or something, and there's someone who you know is just hired to be there, right? Or maybe you've been to a business or a restaurant, and there's someone who they are just there because they get a paycheck. They're not the owner. The owner would come to your table and talk to you and make sure everything's okay and such, and they basically just take your order and go back to the back, or they take your... You know that situation, right? There's a difference between the one who is just hired to be there and the one who is the owner. So Jesus kind of talks about this with this. He says, there's hired hands. And hired hands, they care nothing for the sheep because they're not theirs. They are just there to do a job. They are there to watch the sheep and take care of the sheep. The other thing about hired hands is that they cave under pressure. When something goes wrong, when the bathroom overflows, when something doesn't turn out right, when there's problems, those who are just hired may be able to say, you know what, that's not my job. Right? The hired hands are just there for that. They cave under pressure when challenges come, and they prioritize their well-being above the well-being of that which they're caring for. So in this case, it says the wolves come, right? And the hired hands say, peace out. It's not my job. I don't get paid enough to do that. And they leave the sheep, and the sheep get scattered. But Jesus is comparing two types. He's saying here's the hired hands, and then there's the good shepherd. And what does the good shepherd do? The good shepherd cares for the sheep because they are his. I promise you, you go to a shop, you can tell the owner. The one who takes care and makes sure everything is where it's supposed to be. The one who takes care of the experience, the one who takes care of the inventory and things like that. In our story today, it talks about the good shepherd who knows his sheep and takes care of his sheep because they are his. And he is invested in them. The good shepherd stands watch over the sheep. And when trials come, when things come against it, when the wolves come, it says that the good shepherd, not the hired hand, the good shepherd is willing to lay down his life for the life of the sheep. And here's what happened. Because the shepherd knows the sheep know his voice, and they trust. That's what it means to have that responsibility, is your responsibility for them, and you care over them because of who they are. And Jesus is the good shepherd who lays down his life, and he's talking about this relationship. Now let me ask, in our lives today, we don't deal a lot with sheep. But aren't there hired hands in our lives? Not people, but things. Things that promise to give you security, things that promise to give you comfort, things that promise to give you control. There are probably some hired hands, some things that talk a lot of talk and say, I've got your back, I'll watch over you. But when trouble and trials come, the things of the world fade away. And it's the good shepherd who is there. So let me ask, where are you putting your trust? And where are you investing in a relationship? Is that with the hired hands of the world, the things of the world that say? Or is that in your relationship with Christ? Relationships require responsibility. The second thing that I think relationships require is knowledge, right? Relationships require knowledge about someone. Now, I'm going to put a face on the screen, and I'll tell you that I know Steve Martin. Let me tell you, I'm going to prove that I know Steve Martin. You ready? He was born August 14th in Waco, Texas. He got his start working in Disneyland selling programs. He's a comedian, does stand-up, wrote for several comedy shows. He wrote for Saturday Night Live and was on Saturday Night Live. He is a great banjo player. He has compiled and was on an album that won the best banjo, a Grammy for the best banjo record in a year, right? And I know what he looks like. If I saw Steve Martin somewhere, I could recognize Steve Martin. So therefore, definitively, I know Steve Martin, right? I don't know Steve Martin. I could recognize him, but I promise you in an airport, I could point him out. But if I went up to him and said, hey, Steve Martin, I'm Russell Martin, he'd be like, that's funny, but who are you? I got a plane to catch. He may be nice. He may entertain a conversation for a minute, but I don't know him. He would probably not loan me money if I asked. Right? Relationships require knowledge. Knowing about someone is not enough. How much of our lives are spent learning about Jesus, reading about Jesus, understanding about Jesus, but knowing who Jesus is? Because relationships require knowledge, and the only way you're going to get that knowledge of somebody is if I sat down with Steve Martin and I became his friend and we talked and we shared lunch and we shared life, and he came over to my house and I invited him in and we lived life together, and he was involved in all aspects of my life. Think about those friends you know. You don't just talk to them on the phone, and you don't just know when their birthday is. Best friends and ones that you know are ones that you have invested in, and they've invested in you. John 10, 14 through 16. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen, and I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. He says, I know these sheep, and he says, I know those sheep. Now guess who those sheep are? We are those sheep that Jesus knows, that he has responsibility for, and he knows. We talked about that if you know the shepherd, if the sheep know the shepherd, they hear his voice. Let me ask you, who are you listening for? Are you listening for the voice of the shepherd? Scripture, Bible study, devotional, worship, all those building blocks of faith we talked about to help build a strong faith. Are you spending time listening and seeking out to know the shepherd more? Or are you listening for the voices that are crying out for your attention? Of fame or money or comfort, easy, quick comfort, lack of responsibility? Are you hearing those hired hand voices? Or are you listening for the shepherd? Relationships require responsibility, and relationships require knowledge. The third thing I want to suggest that relationships require is obedience and sacrifice. So John 10, 17 through 18 says this. The reason that my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down and the authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. So Jesus is talking about that relationship, isn't he? The relationship with the Father, the relationship of intimacy, that there is trust, that the Father commands, but Jesus willingly obeys. And Jesus says, I am willing to lay down my life for the sheep. Talks about it. And he alludes to this, that which is going to happen, which we celebrate at Easter, which we are leading up to, and that is the time where he is arrested and tried and crucified and buried and put in the grave. And then Easter Sunday, we celebrate 3 days later that he rose from the grave. Let me ask you, who are you striving to obey? We are Christians. If we say we are Christian, that means that we follow Jesus. And Jesus says, in order to follow me, you must lay down your life. Maybe that is your life. Maybe that's all those things that you've built that encompass your life. What are you willing to lay down? Your time, your calendar, your priorities, your money, the things that you've worked so hard to build up. Jesus says you must be willing to set things aside and to put me first if you want to follow me? Who are you willing to obey? The things of the world, the directions you get pulled in every day, or listening to and obeying what God calls you to do? 3 things about relationships. And I think this verse talks about relationship. Relationships require responsibility. Relationships require true knowledge. And relationships require obedience and sacrifice. The question is who do you want a relationship with? Do you want that relationship with the Good Shepherd who brings life and is willing to lay down his life for you? Or do we settle for the relationships with the world that will fade away once trouble comes? Would you pray with me?